subject is 19th-century Chinese pioneers of Humboldt's neighboring counties. I'd like to acknowledge that the Clarke Museum sits on unceded Wiyot land in Eureka. Despite local, state, and federal government actions, the Wiyot people persevered and are still living in our community today. I now ask everybody to take a moment to double check their cell phones, make sure that the sound is off. Thank you. We thank the California Historical Society for loaning their traveling exhibition. We also thank our respective partners, including the Clarke Historical Museum staff and volunteers, Humboldt Asians Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, the Humboldt County Historical Society, and the Humboldt County Library for making this exhibition possible at the local level. This exhibit and the associated events are made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. During the run of the Chinese Pioneers exhibit, artifacts connected with Chinese communities in Humboldt and Trinity counties will be on display here at the Clarke through December 29th. The exhibit features items from the collections of the Clarke Museum, the Humboldt County Historical Society, and the Trinity County Historical Society. I'd now like everyone that had a part in making not just the exhibit, but all of these panel discussions and events possible to please stand up or raise your hands so the folks in this room and at home can know that you put in an absolute amount of effort. Give them a big round of applause. There were many more folks that made this exhibit and this panel discussion possible, and for those of you that are watching from home right now, you have my most sincere thanks. I'd now like to invite Dr. Sue Lee Mossman to share some more words on the experience of seeing this whole project come to fruition.
Hello, everyone. And as chair or project coordinator of the Chinese Pioneers exhibit and the associated events, I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone and thank you all for coming, to the panelists and our guests as well. So thank you very much for attending. This project definitely would not have happened if it were not for the outstanding committee that I've had the pleasure to work with and the privilege really to work with. These are all like professional historians and artists and oh my gosh. and they, you know, with their wonderful creative ideas and their hard work, what you see is the exhibit over there at you know, here, I mean. And the, I hope you'll take a look at the display cases. There's been a lot of thought put into those, the design and the content of the display cases. This committee was responsible for the delicious reception food that we've had, and also for the concept and the panelists who, you know, on the symposia. This committee also organized the film screening that happened a week ago or 10 days ago at the Humboldt County Library. Did I forget anything else? Oh, the grant writers. Oh my gosh. They were essential for, you know, paying for the food, of course, and all the other expenses. So I just want to thank you all, and I want to acknowledge, actually, by name, the core members of this committee, and they include Dr. Alex Service. And Alex, I think you know, most of you know her, because she's the curator of the Fortuna Depot Museum, and she's been the past president of the Humboldt Historical Society, and she's on the committee of the Eureka Chinatown Monument. And Amy Uecki over there, grant writer extraordinaire, along with a couple of other people like Vicki and Sherry. And she is the chair of our Eureka Chinatown Monument Committee, and she's been serving, of course, on the Chinese Pioneers Committee. And there is Mr. Josh, our executive director and curator of the Clarke, and let's see, Josh and Pat, who's standing there in the back. She's the one who organized all the food. And Susan, who's not here today. Yeah. So Pat has been, or is the vice president of the board of the Clarke Historical Museum, and she's been active in the Humboldt Historical Society. And Susan. Susan's not here with us tonight, but she and Dr. Alex Service, were responsible for the film screening and lots of other things. So, and then I also want to acknowledge Lele. Where is she? Lelena Du Bois. She is the marketing and events coordinator for the Clarke and did wonderful work in marketing the exhibit and the associated events and putting everything on, social media, which I don't know anything about. So we really are indebted to her too. So thank you all, and let's just give them a good round of applause. Thank you. The members of this committee have been meeting since February of 2023, would you believe? But we didn't really get into regular meetings until this year, and every month we've had a meeting, and sometimes more than one meeting. And they've just been wonderful in putting all this together.
And we should give a round of applause for this woman because she's made it through.
Thank you. Yeah, we're very pleased, the committee is very pleased that this exhibit and the associated events are sponsored locally by the Clarke Historical Museum and the Humboldt County Historical Society, the Humboldt County Library, and Humboldt Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, HAPI. For HAPI, this Chinese Symposium is part of a larger initiative, which we call the Eureka Chinatown Project. And the Eureka Chinatown Project, the goal of the project is to recover the history of the early Chinese settlers in Eureka and in Humboldt County. As an American of Chinese ancestry, just being part of all of this has been a very exciting and heartwarming learning experience for me, and I'm very grateful to be part of this. Ken Burns has said, "The power of compelling stories, memories, and anecdotes help us to understand the present in which we exist." For me, there are themes in this exhibit that resonate. Themes like, the social and political disenfranchisement and judicial disenfranchisement of the Chinese resonate with themes that we're facing nowadays, currently, with some current issues like immigration, citizenship, border control. It's important to know what's happened in the past so that we can understand that it can still happen. We're doing this so that we don't repeat the errors of the past, and that we also don't demonize or marginalize people who are somewhat different. Personally, recovering the story of the early Chinese settlers here in Humboldt County is also helping me to learn what the people look like, what the people were like, who look like me, And, but this recovering the forgotten history of the Chinese is not just for me, and not just for other Chinese or other people of Asian origins. It's for all of us, because we all live here. It's the story of this place where we live, this place that we call home. It's enabled us also to connect with other groups like the Moon family, whose members are indigenous and Chinese, and their Chinese origins can be traced back to their ancestor, Charlie Moon. And as you know, Charlie Moon was one of the few Chinese who was able to remain in this area after the expulsion of the Chinese in 1885 from Eureka. And now we have a Charlie Moon Way now that's located in what was once upon a time the historic Chinese Eureka Chinatown. I just want to say that the story of the Chinese has largely been untold. And so I think incorporating this history of the Chinese into the history of our common home enriches it and contributes to the diversity of the story and gives us a unique identity that is us, that is what we call Humboldt, and also what we call California, too. So we welcome all of you to the Chinese Pioneers exhibit and to this afternoon's symposium. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Sue. The format of this panel is very straightforward. I will ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves, followed by 2 questions tailored to their expertise. Please save your individual questions for the end of the discussion when we will have time for questions from the audience. Without further ado, let's meet our panel. Dero Forslund. Dero is the Museum Director of the Trinity County Historical Society and former County Clerk Recorder and Assessor of Trinity County. Dr. Alex Service. Alex is a member of the Eureka Chinatown Project, a Humboldt County Historical Society board member, and she has been curator of the Fortuna Depot Museum since 2009. She has her BA in East Asian Studies from UCLA and her MA and PhD in Medieval Studies from the University of York in England. Next, we have Lorraine Hee-Chorley. Lorraine is the president of the nonprofit corporation for the Temple of Kwantai and a descendant of the original family. She also teaches part-time at Mendocino College. And last, we have Jessica Chu. Jessica is the president of the Helen and Joe Chu Foundation, a humanities-based nonprofit that uses Chinese American history as a form of education and cultural enrichment to inspire the general public and the next generation to pursue higher education in a rural community. And I just want to emphasize, too, that 3 out of our 4 panelists, not to discount the drive for Alex from Fortuna, but they had to go a long way to get here tonight. And I thank each of you for taking the time not just to meet with us in planning for this, but to actually make it out here. It means the world to us. I'd also like to throw out a special thank you to Dero in particular, who made it possible to obtain a loan from the Trinity County Historical Society. Many of the artifacts that you'll see out in the main hall are only here because he took the time to work with me over many months and our committee make that possible. Thank you, Dero. All right. First up, of course, is Dero. Dero, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself for about 2 minutes or so?
About 2 minutes, huh?
Oh, and one more thing for all of the panelists tonight, please make sure that the mic is right up close to you so that everyone can hear you, okay? Otherwise, I will pester you about it.
So I guess, as he said, I was a county recorder and that sort of thing. I first went to Trinity County when I was less than a year old. My mother had me. I was born in Oakland, but my family lived in Trinity County in Lewiston. My dad was running a dredge there, so I've had a lot of Trinity County experience over the years. Basically, retired from the county 10 or 15 years ago, and decided that probably there was something I needed to do, and that was work at the museum. So that's why I'm here. Happy to be part of this and part of what keeps the museum going at Trinity County. So.
Thank you. And the first question for you, how large did the Chinese population get in Trinity County, and what occupations were they employed in? Are there any particular notable accomplishments they made during the 19th century?
Well, the Chinese population in the early years, I did a little research on the census bureaus and whatnot. In 1860, they said that there was 1,700 Chinese in Trinity County and 3,300 whites. I'm going to use the term Chinese and whites kind of that way because everybody there was a foreigner, and so basically we had the Asians primarily from China. In 1870, it went down to 1,100 Chinese and about 2,000 whites, so they had a reduction there. In 1880, there was 2,000 Chinese and 2,700 whites. But by the late 1800s, by the late 1800s, in the beginning of 1880, there was 2,000 Chinese there. By 1890, there was about 500. So they had moved away quickly. Several things caused that to happen. Chinese exclusion, whatnot, running out of gold. A lot of them went to other gold strikes. The Chinese were in Trinity County for one purpose: gold. They all came to Trinity County. They didn't all end up by being gold miners, but that's why they were all there. And so we end up with basically a lot of gold miners. A number of them would have followed the gold into the Yukon and every place else that it would have gone to. But when they were there, they were pretty well established. They had basically cemeteries, hospitals, restaurants, stores. They provided essentially all the features that anybody would need, particularly those from the Chinese. So they were well established with they were there. We had a fairly significant Chinatown. There's a few remnants of that left, but not much. They were particularly effective in some of their mining operations that really made them more successful, maybe even than the whites were. They had some things called water wheels that they used in a river that weren't here before, but they brought that technology with them from China. And so they would put what we call a wing dam in a river, which would move the channel of the river over a little ways. And so then they would put a wing dam in there with a earthen dam and run the river along the side of it, put a water wheel in that river, which is turning from the river, and use that water wheel to pump the water out of the riverbed. So then they could actually mine the bed of the river. So they were mining lands that hadn't been mined before by anybody. And so those water wheels became pretty prevalent, and the whites ended up by using them as well. Having a water wheel in a river, though, is a particular problem depending upon the weather. In 1861, there was probably the largest flood that Trinity County has ever seen, even till today, washed out all of the water wheels, and that really did cause a lot of the miners to leave at that point in time. Another technology that they used that kind of fit in with the rest of the thing was, and there's an example of that in the exhibits that are here, is that they used something, they created something called a rammed earth wall. In Trinity County, there had been 4 or 5 fires that essentially destroyed the town early on. The whites essentially went back and started building the buildings out of brick. So if you look in Weaverville, you'll see a lot of these old brick buildings. Well, the Chinese used something like that, but it was a rammed earth wall where they actually took mud, it was dampened mud, and rammed it between a form and laid lumber in the middle of it so that it would stabilize it, and that became the building material they used in the defense of fires. And so when the town burned after those rammed earth walls went in, the buildings themselves, they would let them burn, because when they got done burning, all they had to do was put a new roof on it, and the building would be there ready to go again. So the rammed earth wall was a fairly significant technology that they brought with them from China. As far as I understand, that's still a technology being used in China today. And there's a couple of examples of those rammed earth walls still in place in Weaverville, if you ever get a chance to look at it. How much more time do I have? Okay, well, a couple of things that happened in Trinity County early on is that when the Chinese saw how important the fraternal organizations were for the white people, particularly the Masonic order, they in fact created their own Chinese masonry. So they had a Masonic hall that was for Chinese, and of course they didn't know anything about the Masonic traditions because those were all kind of secret, and so they created their own Masonic processes and whatnot in a Masonic hall for themselves. Masonry in Trinity County was pretty important at that point in time. I mean, if you weren't a Mason, you probably weren't somebody important in the county. So the Chinese pretty well matched that on their own. The other thing that I think is a little bit important from the standpoint of the Chinese at that particular point in time that's, I think, a little bit of a Trinity County history is we all know about the foreign miners tax, where they charged $4 a head for foreign miners. Of course, the foreign miners were just Chinese. They did not charge the foreign miners tax on anybody who wasn't a Chinese. So in 1870, there was a lawsuit filed in San Francisco, and they came up and they actually arrested the Trinity County Sheriff for collecting the foreign miners tax. Now, he was doing that under the direction of the state of California, but he did, in fact, get tried in San Francisco, was found guilty of it, so because he was, in fact, collecting the foreign miners tax, but the fine that he had to pay for doing that was $20. So we essentially were a real test case for the foreign miners tax finally getting taken out. So, thank you.
And second question. Today, the most well-known 19th century Chinese resident of Humboldt County's Charlie Moon, is there a particular individual in Trinity County with a similar background that has stood the test of time more than others?
Well, it's a little hard to think about Chinese in Trinity County from the standpoint of the pioneers because most of them left. And I'm going to try to say some Chinese names here. I apologize because I don't know how to pronounce them. I suspect they're just phonetically like they're written. But Lim Ok Foon came to Trinity County into California in 1867 as a laborer. He worked on the railroads. He worked on farms and that sort of thing. He was here long enough to pay off his debts. His goal was to get enough money to get back to China. And that's really all of the Chinese that came here did not come here to live in California or United States. They came here to make enough money to take it home, to live off of that money they took home. So that was their goal for almost every single one of them. So Lim Ok Foon came and was successful and had worked here for 14 years. When he did, he brought his son over, who was Lim Soo Kin, as a 16-year-old. So Lin Soo Kin came over at his father's request as a 16-year-old, and initially went into mining and was pretty successful at it. His father did in fact go back to China, but Lim Soo Kim stayed here. Was pretty successful in mining. While he was here, he learned Americanized cooking from a local hoteler there, and so he opened up a restaurant and whatnot, and was fairly successful with that. But he named the restaurant Sam Lee. Sam Lee was translated to three profit or three waves of prosperity. So that he was naming his restaurant, and he called it Sam Lee. But the meaning for it was this prosperity is what he was describing it at. But everybody that used Sam Lee's restaurant said, we're going to go down to Sam Lee's. So pretty quick, Sam Lee, Lim became Sam Lee. So Sam Lee basically became known as Sam Lee in the town and that sort of thing. So he was fairly successful for a while at the restaurant business, and in fact, in 1897, went down to San Francisco and found this lady, if I can get the right names here, Chang Yan Hao, a 21-year-old gal there, and he paid her family $240 in gold for the right to marry her, and she agreed to be married to him, and came back to Trinity County. Did not even know where Weaverville, that never even heard of it. So she comes back to Trinity County as a 21-year-old. We have some of her clothing out there in the display. So Sam Lee, basically, they had 7 kids altogether. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But he went back to mining. He had been in the restaurant business and that sort of thing, was pretty successful at that, but had the gold fever, I guess, because he went back to mining and was very unsuccessful at mining at that point in time. So he ran up a lot of debts and whatnot, and got to the point where, and why we talk about Sam Lee is he's one of the Chinese that stayed in Trinity County, and there were very few that did. In the 1920s and so, they were down around 50 Chinese left, so everybody had left. But Sam Lee stayed there, but the reason he stayed there is because he couldn't afford to go home. he had to pay off his debt, and so he was basically living there. He ended up by leasing a small ranch in town. It was small. It was in town. It was 30 acres, and that's a big piece of land for in town of Weaverville, and grew produce on it. So at that point in time, he had a family that he had 7 kids. One of them was a individual. If I get the right names here, Moon Lim Lee. So Moon Lim Lee was his, I think, 3rd son or whatnot. And basically what happened with Sam Lee is he was growing produce, and this is a picture of Moon Lee, what we call Moon Lee now, Moon Lim Lee, actually carting produce around town on a cart when he was 7 years old. So they were very, very poor, probably weren't able to pay their rent and that sort of thing, but people carried him on, and they got back into the, well, he started I guess I would call it a grocery store. They were selling their produce out of this grocery store. So they ended up by being pretty successful in the grocery store, to the point where they had built a larger store, one of the large markets in town now that's closed, but was actually ran by them in the 1930s. And Purity came in with a competing store, and they actually put Purity out of business. So they were really successful with their grocery business. Let's see. Yeah, that was it. And part of what happens with me, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we're talking about 19th century stuff, and I'm talking 20th century. Because the real reason for wanting to talk about Sam Lee is to talk about Moon Lee. So Moon Lee, and Sam had 7 kids. All of them went to school in Trinity County, to the American school, they had a Chinese school, but all of his kids went to the Americanized school. So they did become Americanized. And Moon Lee, at that point, he was Lim, but he was Moon Lee's son, or Sam Lee's son, so he became Moon Lee. So he ended up by having his name changed as well. And we talk about Moon Lee, we really talk about somebody who is very, very poor to start. Like I say, running a cart selling groceries at 7 years old. Worked at the grocery store. Ended up by starting a hardware store eventually, because they sold a grocery store. But the accomplishments of Moon Lee from the standpoint of Trinity County are beyond what almost anybody can think of. And Moon's characterization was that when he was there poor, everybody helped his family. And so that's the motto he used for himself, because he was helping everybody after that. And so he was really, really an important character in Trinity County history. Let's see. He learned to fly and landed the first airplane to land in Weaverville's airport. He helped organize a Rotary Club in 1938. He was a member and a board member of the Weaverville Fire Department, the Sanitary District, Chamber of Commerce, president of the Inter-County Chambers of Commerce in Northern California, was a Boy Scout commissioner, representative of the Salvation Army, a state fire commissioner. Governor Reagan appointed him to the State Highway Commission, and probably his most famous thing for Trinity County's perspective is he in fact donated the Josh House to the state park system. And so that's why we have the Josh House now. He was essentially caretaking it before it became part of the state park system. So Moon was just somebody that we all, and I was fortunate enough to live there long enough that he was still around. He was still in Rotary Club when I was as well. Some of the things that we think about with him, for instance, back then, Rotary's not that way so much anymore, but back in the 1980s, Rotary Club really depended upon attendance, and if you didn't have perfect attendance in that club, it was pretty much hard to be there. Moon Lee fell off of his building and broke his hip, so he's in a hospital. They actually had a Rotary Club meeting at the hospital, so he wouldn't miss, and then they brought him to the Rotary Club meetings on a gurney, And so he actually put on programs and that sort of thing at the Rotary Club when he was still in a cast, in almost a full body cast. And so those are just his, he was such an important part of our community that we really can't think about Chinese history. And the fact is that if Sam Lee hadn't stayed, then he may not have stayed as well. And so the fact is we have, that standpoint from me is that that's really where it starts from, is that we had somebody who was here and became an Americanized Chinese. Unfortunately, he's passed now. His granddaughter lives here on the coast, and there are no more Chinese living in Trinity County that are from the Chinese history. Anyway, let's see. Oh, in 1956, the Trinity Journal called him Mr. Weaver. So,
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Dr. Alex, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right, let's see. Is this thing on at the moment? Goodness knows. So yes, as Josh mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in East Asian Studies, but then I kind of segued into other topics, did European medieval studies as graduate work, and then in working in the museums community, I've mostly worked with various different local history institutions in different parts of the United States, but I had really kind of moved away from that East Asian Studies focus that I began with. So it's been really exciting to get involved with the Eureka Chinatown project and start to explore some of the topics that I really hadn't worked with for the past 20 or 30 years. And another hat that I sometimes wear is as a tour guide for the Old Town Haunted History Ghost Tours here in Eureka. And I've been doing that since 2011. And it always used to bother me when I was doing those tours that I would have to say, well, there's really no visible trace, no monument, no acknowledgement to the fact that there was this Chinese community here in the 19th century and that the expulsion here was such a traumatic and important historical event. There was just nothing. There was not even a tiny little historical plaque where the Chinatown was located, nothing at all like that. But since 2021, with the Eureka Chinatown project coming into existence, that's taken off, and now it's totally different. Now there's Charlie Moon Way given as the name to the alley that goes to the old Chinatown area. There are two informative historical wayfinding plaques on 5th Street that tell some of the history of those communities. And of course, the Eureka Chinatown project is working on fundraising and all the planning that's involved, and working with the city of Eureka to create a monument to Eureka's Chinatown and to the whole history of Asian communities here in this county. And I didn't get to check the gift shop when I came in here, but I believe it's there. I think we've got the current issue of the Humboldt County Historical Society's Humboldt Historian magazine in the Clarke Museum gift shop at the moment, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of that if you don't have it yet, because it has several articles by Eureka Chinatown Project members about the Chinatown Project itself and about the mural that's also part of the new, really bringing visual acknowledgement to Eureka's Chinese history. So definitely want to make sure that everyone who hasn't read that yet will go ahead and pick up a copy and do that. So yes, I'm just really, really glad to have been able to become part of this process of exploring Eureka's and Humboldt's Chinese history and really delving more into discovering some of the details of that story.
And first question, what can we learn about 19th century Chinese communities in Del Norte County from surviving records?
Well, I only just about 3 weeks ago became the person who was going to give this part of the presentation. So I'm definitely not an expert in Del Norte County's Chinese history. I've just done sort of a crash course of getting as much information as I can take on in the past 3 weeks or so. And in that process, I want to thank, I'm going to butcher everybody's names, I'm absolutely sure, but Karen Betelyowski, Michelle Jodoin, and Claudia Boyle at the Del Norte County Historical Society, and also Cal Poly Humboldt interns with the Clarke Historical Museum, Sarah Rendon and Wolfgang Robinson, who've been involved in part of this research project to bring this information together. So in looking at the records and what they do tell us about Del Norte County Chinese history, mostly what I looked at is census records. And in 1860, what we see is 278 Chinese residents in Del Norte County, and that includes one woman. And at that point, the total county population as listed in the census records was 1,993. So that means that the Chinese population was about 13.95% of the total as listed in the census. Now, dividing that up a bit, in Crescent City, it was 104 Chinese people listed in that census. Sort of broader Crescent City area, Crescent City post office, but not in the town itself, another 25 Chinese people. Crescent Township, but on Smith River, or the area of the town of Smith River, there's 21 additional people. Rural locations excluding HAPI Camp, which at that point was part of Del Norte County, there's another 80 Chinese people. And then in HAPI Camp and its vicinity, there's another 47. And looking at sort of the age demographics that we see in that, the youngest of these Chinese immigrants are several miners. That was the main occupation that Chinese people in Del Norte County were working, as shown in these census records, was mostly gold mining. So several miners living at Smith River. One of them was 10 years old, two of them were 11 years old, one of them was 12 years old, and there were three 13-year-olds. And they were all living in one household, which also had a 22-year-old and a 23-year-old in it. The oldest Chinese immigrant listed in that census record is a 60-year-old man, and he's a miner at HAPI Camp. Now, the occupations that these people were working, of course, the majority of them were miners. We had two people who were listed as a boarding house operator, and they were both in Crescent City. There was one cook in Crescent City area and another 4 cooks in HAPI Camp, 2 merchants in HAPI Camp, a saloon keeper in HAPI Camp, and only one person listed as a washerman, and he was in Myrtle Creek. Actually, no, it's 2 of them. One in Myrtle Creek, which is sort of greater Crescent City area, and then another one in Crescent City itself. Now, of course, the trouble with census records is you only get them every 10 years, so we don't really know much about what's going on with people between those census records. But going on to 1870, in that one, we've got 195 Chinese people. So it's actually gone down from 1860 when it was 278. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm speculating that one reason why you might have a smaller Chinese population in Del Norte around 1870 is that some people may have gone off to work on the major railroad construction efforts, the Transcontinental Railroad, 1869 sort of period. So that's just sort of a hypothesis I've got as to why the population might be smaller at that point. So this 195 Chinese people includes 7 women, 3 of them in Crescent City and 4 in HAPI Camp. The total county population at that time was 2,022, so that makes the percentage of the total county population, which were Chinese immigrants, as 9.64% of the total. And dividing it up again in Crescent City, including the township and sort of surrounding area, you've got only 28 Chinese people. In something called Mountain Township, which also is Crescent City Post Office, there's 11. Smith River, there's 3. HAPI Camp, however, has incredibly blossomed. It's 153 Chinese residents in HAPI Camp. Looking at the ages again, the youngest were several 15-year-old miners, and the oldest was a miner who was 61 years old, and there's also a couple who are 60. Once again, vast majority of them are working as miners. There was one butcher in HAPI Camp, 13 cooks in Crescent City in the vicinity, 3 cooks in HAPI Camp and vicinity, 2 in Smith River, and 1 in Mountain Township. 2 of these Chinese immigrants in the 1870 census were listed as gamblers, and they were both in HAPI Camp. Got 2 hotel keepers, 1 in Crescent City and 1 in HAPI Camp. All 7 of the women are listed as keeping house. There's 1 person listed as an innkeeper in HAPI Camp. There are laborers, a few, 1 in Crescent City, 1 in Smith River, and 1 in HAPI Camp. Only 1 Chinese merchant listed, also in HAPI Camp, and once again, only 1 washing and ironing worker listed, also in HAPI Camp. 1880, we're up to 343 Chinese people, and 9 of them are women. County population, 2,584, so the Chinese residents were about 12.11% of the total county population. And Crescent City's now got 53 Chinese residents, including 5 women, Smith River's got 5, Mountain Township has 34, and Happy Camp and vicinity has 251, including 4 women. And how those occupations divide up, you've got 8, let's see, did I skip a page? Probably yes. Okay, here we go. Ages, the youngest was a 1-month-old boy in Crescent City, and also an 8-year-old adopted girl in the same household, and the parents who ran that household were the operators of a hotel in Crescent City. And aside from those 2, the youngest of the Chinese residents of the county at this point are 14-year-old, several 14-year-old boys or young men working as minors, and the oldest was a 62-year-old minor. And once again, vast majority of the people included in this discussion are minors, but we also have 3 barbers in Happy Camp and vicinity, 1 bookkeeper in Mountain Township, 1 butcher in Crescent City, and 1 in Happy Camp. 2 people in Crescent City are listed as chopping wood, 13 cooks in Crescent City and 2 in Smith River, 3 dairy hands in Smith River, 1 druggist in Happy Camp, 1 person listed as a foreman in Crescent City, 1 grocer in Happy Camp, 5 hotel keepers in Crescent City. The 3 women in Crescent City are listed as keeping house. You've got 8 laborers in Crescent City and 33 in Mountain Township. Still only 1 laundry, so that's very, very interesting that the laundry profession was not something that was much followed in Del Norte County, and that 1 laundry was in Crescent City. 3 men working in Crescent City are listed as packer. 1 in Crescent City is listed as packs water. 1 physician in Happy Camp. 3 women in Happy Camp area are listed as prostitutes, and 1 shoemaker in Crescent City. Now, comparing the numbers with Humboldt County, it shows that even though Humboldt County had a larger population throughout this whole period than Del Norte did, the Chinese populations in Del Norte County were larger than Humboldt's Chinese populations. So in 1860, Humboldt had only 79 Chinese residents. In 1870, 92 Chinese residents, and in 1880, 243 Chinese residents. So that means that in both 1860 and 1870, Del Norte had more than twice as many Chinese residents, and in 1880, there were about 100 more Chinese residents in Del Norte than in Humboldt. Really, I think because of the fact that Del Norte had so much more mining going on in it than Humboldt ever did. Now I'm going to very quickly, hopefully, race through these images. If this works. Does it want to work? No, it doesn't want to work. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I just went up to Crescent City last week to visit the Del Norte County Historical Society to get some of this information, and that's from a plaque they have in the downtown area of Crescent City now about the tsunami zone and talking about the famous 1964 tsunami that wiped out most of the area around the port of Crescent City. And so the area that was Crescent City's Chinatown was bordered by 2nd and 3rd Street and by I and H Streets. And that's over in what I guess for you is the left-hand side of that image near where the number 6 is there. Now, the Chinese businesses were not completely restricted within that area, but that was the main sort of center of the Chinese business and residence activity in Crescent City. And oops, backwards. How do I go forwards? That one, I thought I pressed that, but whatever, it doesn't like me. Okay, so here's a picture I took last week. So that's looking north from 2nd, looking up H Street to the area that was once the Chinatown area. Now, of course, all the buildings are modern because they were all built after the 1964 tsunami. And there's another one from the other direction looking south along H from 3rd Street. This is from the Sanborn Fire Insurance map from 1898. Now, this is about 13 years after the expulsion of Crescent City's Chinese residents, which took place in the summer of 1886. So the area that was the Chinatown area is pretty much right in the center of that image there. But I think probably a few or perhaps none of the buildings that are shown there in 1898 are still the ones that were there when the Chinese residents were in that area. Now, this is a photo from the Del Norte County Historical Society collection, and as far as I know, at least so far, this is the only photo that we know of that actually does show Chinese residents of Del Norte County. They're in Gasky, a bit north and east of Crescent City. don't have the date of it. It may be late 19th or early 20th century. And even though there were expulsions from Crescent City in 1886, and Del Norte County powers that be did make kind of a big deal about supposedly having few or no Chinese residents, just like happened in Humboldt County, there actually were Chinese mining operations going on in Del Norte County in the early 1900s. So it's possible that this photo is from after that expulsion period. There's a little closer view of the men in the photo. And frustratingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, considering some of the history, the only two people who are identified in that photo are the two non-Chinese people, Phil Stevens with the suspenders and the dark shirt right in the center, and then the man at the far right from your perspective is charmingly identified as Indian Pete, but none of the other folks are identified. Now, one person who is very famous as, in a way, Del Norte County's equivalent of Charlie Moon in terms of being famed as the one Chinese who remained in Del Norte County, even though this is, of course, not true. There were a number of other people, but he's the one who's gotten that kind of fame. He's known as Doc or Old Doc, and here he is in the 1880 census. And there's a newspaper reference to him in 1899 of him visiting town. He'd been living in Curry County in Oregon because when the expulsion furor was really intense, his employers who ran a ranch near Smith River, they also had a ranch in Curry County, so he went up to work at that ranch. But then he later came back down to Del Norte County. And this is material that they've got copies of in the Del Norte County Historical Society collection. This is Doc's certificate of residence from 1896 and when he was living in Oregon. And it's just really wonderful to have because it does at least have his photos, so we get to have at least a glimpse of what he looked like. And there's a close-up of that same photo as it was used in an essay that was written using some of the material from the Historical Society collection. And then this is a pretty striking thing. He actually, in 1893, filed his intention to become a citizen of the United States. It almost certainly did not come to fruition because in connection with the Chinese exclusion laws, it had been decreed that Chinese people were not eligible to become citizens. So as far as I know, he never officially was allowed to become a citizen, but he had stated his intention to do that in 1893. And let's see, so that is connected with my second question, so I'll pass it back over to Josh.
Thank you, Alex. And I think we'll circle back. For time's sake, I'm going to kick it to Lorraine now, but we will definitely circle back if time allows. Lorraine, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Well, actually, I'm coming full circle, even though I am from Mendocino County and actually am the great-granddaughter of the first Chinese immigrant to arrive in Mendocino County. I actually went to Humboldt State and received my BA and MA here. So I worked here, worked and actually went to school here. And as Sue was kind enough to take me to the mural to see Ben Chin, because I worked for Ben Chin when I was in my graduate year here at school. So it's kind of full circle and have that connection. So basically, as Josh had said, I teach part-time at the Mendocino Junior College, and in addition to overseeing the Temple of Kwandai, and just to Dero to let you know, I don't refer to the temple as a Josh house because it is a term that was given by the White Society, and that all temples have a proper name, and so I always refer to our temple as the Temple of Kwandai. So. And I would like you to do that for the Weaverville one. So that's my background in a nutshell.
Thank you. The Chinese population varied along the coast, but what makes Mendocino's population unique?
Well, first of all, listening to Alex in terms of her having census records in terms of what the population of Del Norte and Eureka area, Mendocino doesn't have any census population records on the Chinese. And one of the reasons is just like my great-grandfather, he sailed to California because of the gold rush, but unfortunately got off course and landed on Casper Beach. And so he was illegal. And so basically he tried to keep a low profile so that he wouldn't be deported. And that is the same story for my grandfather, who actually came in during the time of the Exclusion Act. And so he came in as a paper son. So they, just as our family passed down to me, was to always keep a low profile within the community. But the thing that makes Mendocino, the town of Mendocino, very different from the rest of the county is that from oral history, Mendocino, the town of Mendocino had the largest Chinese population that I have been able to glean from all the history that's in bits and pieces throughout the county. And basically, according to my father's oral history, there were about 500 to 700 Chinese residing in the town of Mendocino, not necessarily all at one time, but mostly in the winter, and they would go out and work into the lumber camps in the spring and the summer. And to kind of emphasize that would be that the Westport community, basically, anytime a Chinese person would arrive in that area, they would either run them out or burn their building down. So they were pretty adamant about not having Chinese presence. And in Fort Bragg itself, again, the evidence is that the basic Chinatown there was only 2 blocks long. And it was a very small population compared to the town of Mendocino. One of the things that we have is that the Chinese actually were scattered throughout the coastline, but the town itself was sort of the meeting point because it had an official temple, a Taoist temple that everyone could actually, of Chinese, could come and worship. And one of the things that was noted by as I call him an old timer, he's no longer alive, he would tell me, you know, when I was a little boy and used to play with your aunts and uncles on the temple steps, and I could look through the windows, but I couldn't go in, and I laughed at it, and I said, it's because you were white. And my grandmother kept that very intact until, you know, was handed down to my generation, which is basically the 4th generation, where we had opened it up to educate the community about the real Chinese history in the town of Mendocino as well as Mendocino County. The thing that makes this town really unique is that Mendocino actually is documented in the Mendocino Beacon that didn't have active monthly meetings on how to expel the Chinese. Racism was still there. It was more covert than overt, whereas in the other areas like Point Arena, which actually bragged about having their monthly meetings on how to expel the Chinese. So that is one of the things that made Mendocino very different. In addition to that, in 1892, when the lumber company brought in the Chinese to build the tunnels for the skunk train that most of you know through the mountains, because the union, Irish Working Union, refused to do it, and also the Chinese were skilled at doing this, so they hired under contract to bring them up from San Francisco. And when they were brought up on January 1st of 1892 through to the Fort Bragg Bay, they were brought to the camp where their residences were, little shacks were built for them to live there and work on the site. The various citizens of the Fort Bragg actually accosted them there and beat them up and escorted them down to Noyle River and told them to keep walking and do not come back. They actually came to Mendocino, which Mendocino at the Carson Hotel, took them in, got them medical help, but then those laborers were brought back to Fort Bragg under protective custody from the Mendocino County Sheriff's Department because the judge had ruled in the lumber company's favor. And what people didn't realize, the lumber company basically controlled the town. They were the financial backing of that town. And so, yes, they needed the laborers because they wanted them to get the tunnel through so they could have the rail system take their lumber over to Willits and then down the way. So again, it shows you how different Mendocino was from the rest of the county itself. One of the things that in regards to the thing is, in addition to the temple itself, is that in order to have a temple, that you had to have a considerable population to support a Taoist temple. And if you're familiar with the Taoist religion, it is not like Christianity where you have a set day to go worship. You worship based on the lunar calendar, and you go to the temple to get advice from the priest and to have special blessings. And that is what this temple provides. This temple actually was built in 1854. It's over 175 years old and has been documented by the state archaeologists in terms of looking at the material that was used as well as the nails that were used as well to secure the building. The temple is a little different from Weaverville because it actually was built a couple blocks up from Chinatown so that when they looked up at Chinatown, they could see the temple itself. And so it has a very distinct, just like Weaverville, it's a very bright red and green, and I'm going to show you a picture later of that structure. But it wasn't built at ground level. It has actually 9 steps, which is designed to keep the evil spirits away, whereas in Weaverville, you have screens in front of your windows because it's... Go ahead.
The initial step is really only about 6 inches.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how the evil spirits couldn't get very high.
Yeah. But the 9 steps, actually, if you count them at the temple, you know, because we have school children come and they love counting the steps to make sure. So, but again, one of the things, in addition to making Mendocino very unique, is that we actually have what is called a legitimate Chinese cemetery. And again, I'll show you another picture of that later, where the county of Mendocino has recognized the cemetery, and it has official name saying Chinese Cemetery, which is in a very specific spot across from the Catholic Church, because it is also the Catholic cemetery, and it's also called Zenith Hill Cemetery as well. But where the Chinese are actually buried, what that site was plotted by a priest, and the priest said, this is where all Chinese bodies need to be buried. And so basically when you go up there, it is the windiest spot in the whole cemetery. But if you stand there and you stand facing south, you see it's totally surrounded by a water source. So again, it is in harmony with the concept of feng shui, being in balance with the wind and the water. In 1920, in that cemetery, all non-American Chinese were unearthed by a company from the Chinese Sixth Company in San Francisco, because they were hired to unearth those bones and ship them back to mainland China, because it is the belief that their souls don't rest unless you're buried in your homeland. So all the Chinese that are buried there now are American-born, and there are children as well as adults in that specific area. So.
Thank you, Lorraine. And what was the global impact of the Chinese on the Mendocino coast in a few minutes?
Okay. The global impact that I have discovered, and it continues to evolve over a period of time, is that the Chinese really were a crucial role in terms of the economy of Mendocino County. And if they didn't have that labor force, I don't think Mendocino County would be where it is today. Because what happened is that it is the Chinese who actually really legitimately introduced the fishing industry to mainstream. They're the ones that knew exactly what was edible and what wasn't edible. And even though the Native Americans are the ones who had harvested the red abalone for quite some time as one of their main food sources, the Chinese also discovered, oh, there's a lot here, and they're huge compared to where they were in mainland China. So what they started doing was to actually harvest the red abalone as well as the shells that they would use, as well as the shrimp and the scallops. They would dry them and then ship them back to mainland China. In addition to that, the sea algae also was just as valuable, and even I, as a child, would harvest the sea algae, and my uncle would come up and buy it from us, and he was the broker who would actually take it to San Francisco and resell it. So those were major economies that were happening within Mendocino County. And in Point Arena, even though they didn't want the Chinese actually would rent the town hall to harvest their sea algae and dry it there as well. And then in the early 20th century, Helen Kwan, who actually had 3 or 4 children, and a husband was a cook at the Union Lumber Company, to help supplement the income, she actually started getting people to harvest the sea algae in Fort Bragg and to buy it from them and then to ship it back to San Francisco as well. In addition to that, they also created a commercial farming for the town of Mendocino, and across the bay, if you're familiar with the geographic of Mendocino, we have a river which we call Big River. And the south of that river, there was a property that had a year-round stream going through it. They rented that property to actually grow vegetables and fruits on the property and sell them back to the town of Mendocino. So, but the global impact is how they created economies that when the Europeans from like New England came, they had an idea of how to make an economy grow and industry also to be created. But a couple of things that in my thing is I'm just showing you some pictures of the Chinatown that actually was on the west side of Mendocino, Main Street. And here again is another picture that's hard to see these. I know here's the official Chinese cemetery, and you can see the sign officially acknowledges that. Then here the picture is talking about is the commercial gardens. It basically was on the total south side of the town of Mendocino, and some people say, oh, that's not really true. But when they were putting the Highway 1 through that area, they actually had to do some digging and some sites, and the state archaeologist came to me and said, we found one of the gardening shacks with the tools in it. So he wanted to tell me that my father's story was very true, where everybody else was telling me it was not true. So this is the global impact. In 1882, we all know is the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1884, Tin Look Eli's family challenged that law, the first person to Chinese of descent to challenge the law of the Exclusion Act, because he was coming back from mainland China after being there for 7 years. And his father, along with other community members, challenged the law because they were saying he could not re-enter the country because he was Chinese. The thing is, he challenged them because he was born in Mendocino. He was American born. He was the first Chinese to challenge the law, and his father took it to Superior Court and won. And it was later when it was taken up to the Supreme Court. But he actually is the stepping point of challenging the federal law. And so thinking that actually Mendocino has a much larger global impact than most people will give it credit for. In addition to the last global impact would be in Fort Bragg, is that what happened in Fort Bragg, I don't know if most of you are familiar with San Francisco and Chinatown. There's an old bakery that's over 100 years old called Eastern Bakery. And the descendants of that bakery basically are from Fort Bragg. And they had the Eastern Grocery. And then when they moved to San Francisco full time, they created the Eastern Bakery, which basically indirectly is related to my family as well. So those are sort of, in really quickly, you know, the global impact of how the Chinese in Mendocino County has affected the world.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Jessica, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jessica. I am the president of the Helen and Joe Chu Foundation. I am the only grandchild of Helen and Joe Chu, and my grandfather was the last Chu resident for Tehama County. Just to tell you a little bit about Tehama County, when the Chinese community anybody in general used to arrive, you would arrive on the boats, dock in San Francisco, and I believe everybody's familiar with the Sacramento River. Yeah, okay. You would take the steamboat. Logically, some people would take it all the way to the last stop, which was a little town called Red Bluff. and Tehama County is that town. It is the county for that town. So we had a bunch of little cities along the river. And my family arrived in 1862. We were one of the first families to settle. There were 5 families that settled in Red Bluff, California. If you look up Good Morning Sacramento, you might see my grandpa Joe Chu talking about the 5 families before he passed away. He was almost 100. But Red Bluff had a Chinatown because if you think about main modes of transportations for that period of time, steamboats were a logical, mode of transportation. So when you arrived at the last steamboat stop, there was a segregated neighborhood on the high bluff, and that was Chinatown, and that's where my family lived. And in Chinatown, we had about 2 blocks that were wooden structures. And those wooden structures existed before my family arrived in 1865. So I date the community into the 1850s. And you would have a business in the front, and in the rear you might have a restaurant, and in the middle you might have some residential lodging areas. And what I'd like to note is actually if you visit Weaverville, the side building has a wooden room that looks very similar to that, where you kind of have like a community gathering area in the front. For our store, it was the traditional Chinese medicine practice in the front. In the middle, there were rooms, and in the rear, there was a kitchen where you could play games and you can drink ninkape and have a meal in the back that overlooked the river. Eventually, those little wooden dwellings became riverfront properties, and that became a very desirable neighborhood. So today, there is no longer a Chinatown. But thanks to HAPI, in 2021, we worked with HAPI in the city of Eureka to implement procedures for the city of Red Bluff, and we named a street Historic Chinatown Alley. So now there's 2 blocks that look down upon the Chinatown that once existed in reflection and memory of our ancestors, and to kind of bring things full circle, as I will be the last person for my family in Tehama County. What I'd also like to add is that our population peaked in the 1880s. So by the 1880s, the Chinese community, amongst our own family's practice, was about 2,000 to 3,000 people on a 2-block radius. So you can tell that it was pretty dense at that time. And that doesn't include what would be on the census record, because on the census record, a lot of the community, some were evading the tax collector and some were evading registering. And the community had reported that the Chinese merchants were encouraging not registering. So the population, if you look at the census data, may not match. Now, a lot of the early Chinese that had arrived in the 1850s, they actually had arrived with Caucasian families that migrated from east to west. And they were primarily cooks, from what we can tell. And those cooks worked for these families as private individuals. And although we do have a segregated section of the cemetery where my family's buried, there are some of these Chinese cooks that are buried with the families that they arrived in. And so there are a few people that are buried outside of our plots. Now, we had 5 families that settled, and my cousin Bruce is going to show you a picture of the 5 families. But the first family that arrived was in 1862, and he settled. So Bruce is my cousin, and he's going to be our supermodel for the day. These panels will actually go outside in the city of Red Bluff. So if you ever decide to come visit, you'll see these panels. These are our 5 families that settled. At the bottom, there's a timeline of comparative, U.S. history laws that impacted the Chinese community, their immigration and their ability to become naturalized citizens and to have a family. And so my family is the Chu family. The Wong family, which is on the left, is the first family. They arrived in 1862. The Fong family came in 1860s. Their family were primarily cooks throughout the community. The On family came in the 1900s with my family, and they helped work at the traditional Chinese medicine practice. And then this is Bruce's dad, dad and mom in the corner, which is the Chin family, who arrived in the 1900s. And like I said, you can watch Good Morning Sacramento, where you hear my grandpa talk about the 5 families too. Now, one of the things that was that I had talked about was the main modes of transportation. So in the 1885 through 1887, we also had multiple expulsion attempts, and they called it the Reading method at that point. And they had come down to the community, and they had gathered and had meetings in Reading, and they came to Red Bluff. But there was a person named Wong Foy. Bruce, are you able to show the second panel? Now, Wong Foy came out in front of this building you see in the middle, and he said, "I'm a property owner, I run a business, and I have every right to be here." And some of the community leaders stood outside, and they talked to the anti-Chinese protesters. And he said that if you take me to the courthouse and you show me where it says that I don't have a right to be here, then the Chinese community will leave. And the community of Red Bluff found those anti-Chinese protesters to be agitators that were becoming a nuisance in the town. These agitators then went to Sacramento, they regrouped, and they came back to Red Bluff, again, attempting to do an expulsion in our town. However, Wong Foy by then was a very prominent person. He provided, he was kind of like the Department of Labor. You would go to his building and you would get a job, and he would provide you lodging. He would take your lodging and your food out of your wages. And he taught himself how to speak English and write English, and so he negotiated labor wages. As a result of that, the Chinese community had an interdependent relationship with the Caucasian community because there was banking. So Wong Foy banked with certain families. My family banked with other families. And so the white merchants and Chinese merchants had an interdependent relationship. So when the expulsion had occurred, it wasn't good business for anybody in town. As a result, Wong Foy actually led several political structures. And in this picture in the middle, this is the Chinese Freemasons. Bruce and I accidentally found this picture in our family collection. Just looking at this baby, we were like, what's that in the background? Ended up being the Chinese Freemasons. So Wong Foy started the Hong Song Society, which was a branch from the San Francisco location. And by 1895, he changed it to the Chinese Freemasons, which is what this picture is, the building in the back. Because the building was a wooden structure, it only actually survived for a couple of months before it was burned down, but it was very elaborate inside. He had built the building from the ground up. It was very elaborately decorated on the inside. And by 1895, he had 100 members. Eventually, by 1912, he changed the practice to the Kuomintang, and at that point, Wong Foy had led different political structures, but the climate changed and political shifts had changed, and that's as a result of the political climate changing in Red Bluff too. And in 1904, there was a famous dragon called Mulong. Does everybody know the story of Mulong from Marysville? Mulong was this great dragon that had arrived, and it was basically paraded around different towns. Well, Wong Foy put an insurance deposit of $2,000 to have Mulong travel from Marysville to Red Bluff, and it participated in the 4th of July parade on Main Street. This only occurred once in Tehama County. And last year in 2023, the descendants and I all gathered together to host Chinese New Year's in Red Bluff for Year of the Dragon. And the Wong Foy descendants decided that in their grandfather's honor, they should rehost it. So the 2 times that the dragon came to Red Bluff was actually hosted by Wong Foy and then his great-great-grandchildren later on. One of the other things I want to mention is modes of transportation. So my grandparent, thank you, Bruce. My grandpa,
I'm still in training.
my grandpa Joe Chu had a restaurant. So after we outgrew the traditional Chinese medicine practice, my great-grandfather had arrived in 1881 as a Methodist missionary, and he was in LA, but his responsibility was bookkeeping and accounting of different traditional Chinese medicine practices, and we've learned that they're all over because an accountant keeps good books, right? So we've been able to figure out the family network from his bookkeeping and accounting. Well, he eventually owned a restaurant in Red Bluff in 1903 because it was across from the railroad depot. And that restaurant was pretty successful. But as modes of transportation changed, we lived on in Chinatown, which was a couple blocks away. And when our wooden dwelling was torn down for a riverfront home in 1948, our family bought a restaurant on Main Street. Well, Main Street was the connection of 99 East meets 99 West. Has everybody been on Highway 99? Or the old Route 99? Yeah, so where East and West meets is where my grandfather's restaurant was. And at that point, we had to teach ourselves to make Chinese American food because our prior restaurants, we did not serve Chinese American food as we would know it today. But my grandfather wouldn't be able to get a job, even though he had a bachelor's degree, he wouldn't be able to get a job as a Chinese American. And most of the Chinese community had faced this challenge and had restaurants as a result of that. Well, when I-5 was constructed, it detoured all the traffic away from many Chinatowns throughout California. So as a result of that, my grandfather would close our restaurant shortly after I-5 was constructed. And a little story to that is that Moon Lim Lee, who you heard the story about, used to patronize my family's restaurant. And after my grandfather retired, he would visit my auntie all the way in Phoenix, Arizona. So we've got some lovely pictures of Moon Lim Lee visiting our restaurant. And when we started tracking down the descendants of Tehama County, we found that Moon Lee had visited other restaurants of Chinese American families too, keeping that network and that community very close.
You had several favorite Chinese
Yeah, we actually heard a story from Jack Frost that Moon Lee had a favorite traditional Chinese medicine doctor, and I believe it was my grandfather's cousin, which is the Chu Yen building in Red Bluff, California, and that closed in 1983 when the last practitioner had died. But there was something that happened that was important in Red Bluff. In 1916, my great-grandmother was detained when she tried to immigrate. Although my great-grandfather was considered a merchant, our family was detained, and my granduncle was detained also. Well, the community of Red Bluff has signed a petition of 20 prominent businessmen and townsmen that were Caucasian, and they signed this petition to allow my family to immigrate. And I'd like to think as a result of that gesture of kindness, my grandfather was born and my aunts were born. And I was, eventually made possible. But my granduncle, who was part of that petition, he had a son, and his son was named Dr. Kenneth Kendall Chu. That son would accidentally enroll in college at Chico State and become the Oyster King in Seattle. And that son, before he became the Oyster King, he was going to study salmon biology. And one of the considerations was Humboldt. So he said it was a 50-50 between University of Washington and Humboldt State. And he would go on to introduce the U.S.-based scallop into China's coastline because the scallops that they had they're not as edible and delicious. And so when we did the street naming, we did it in on his birthday in his honor. And I'd like to thank Eureka and the city of Eureka for helping make that possible, that we did the street naming.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Now is the time that I will kick it to the audience. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please raise your hand and I will be around with the microphones so that you can ask one or several of them a question.
Josh, can I ask if they have any questions for me?
Oh.
My wife is recovering from back surgery. This is the first time she's been away from home in about 2 years. And so she's about wear it out, so. if
True
you could get
warrior.
Anything from me, I'd be happy to take care of that when we get out of here.
Does anybody have any questions for Dero?
I understand there were contract negotiations between people from mainland China to come here and work, whether it was in the mines or railroads. What do you know about that? Were these systems fair? Who oversaw them? And
The only kind of contracts that might have been with the Chinese companies, the CFs and those kind of people. But we've not seen any evidence of that in Trinity County. Like I say, those kind of contracts probably would have been with the Chinese companies. When the Chinese came into San Francisco, depending on what part of China they came from, they would become a member of one of the local companies. There was, I think, 7 of them altogether. There was 5 of them in Trinity. And so that's the level where the contracting might have been done. I don't think it was done at the level of where they were going to end up by being. Because they were paying, basically they were probably under contract because they were paying for their fare to get over here. And so the contracts probably were at that level. I've never seen anything like that in Trinity. I don't know about the others, but so.
Any other questions for Dero specifically? Maybe time for one more?
Just a comment, I got to kind of know Moon Lee also, got to meet him and see him several times with the highway, because I worked for Caltrans, and he'd stop up for a little lunch sometime when he was visiting our Eureka office.
He was appointed to the highway commissioner. He was very big on the highway. He actually had a proposal out there where he wanted to have 299 be Winnemucca to the sea. He wanted 299 to run from Winnemucca clear to here. Never happened ever, but he was very influential in the highway department, partly because he actually used the highways a lot. I mean, he and Sam both hauled supplies from Sacramento to Weaverville by truck and whatnot. So they were not only interested in that sort of thing, but they actually used those highways to work with, so they knew what they were all about. So, but I do have to go. I have several documents here that I'm going to leave. Trinity that's got a transcribed interview with Moon Lee. This is a booklet that was put together with the archaeological people when his building burned. They built a bank there, and this got all the archaeological on it, but there's a lot of interesting stuff about the history of that. This is Gold Mountain by H.K. Wong. This is part of a much bigger book, but this is the Moon Lee part of it. And Wright Hanover, over the years, copied every single article in the Trinity Journal about Chinese in here. So I'm leaving all of these with the Clarke, so hopefully they can be used as a research focus for you guys. But I do have to leave. I apologize for leaving early.
Thank you, Dero.
For Alex, Historical Society has a whole set of the Trinity journals.
Yes, and it's a great resource.
Yeah. We sell whole sets.
After I gave mine away, I had to buy another set for you guys.
We actually just reprinted six issues just this last month, so we can keep having the whole sets. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. This message is for Lorraine. You mentioned during your talk something about paper sun. What is that?
Paper sun actually is when someone takes someone else's name that person that they're taking the name is swearing it's their boy or their son, and it really isn't. They're just paying, what my grandfather did is paid someone to say, hey, I'm related to you, therefore I can come in. Yep. But it was a way to get around the system. And also what we don't hear a lot about is there were paper daughters too, but they weren't a priority in the Chinese culture. It was, you know, getting the sons here and not the girls.
Anyone else have any particular questions? Yes.
I have just a comment, if you can hear me or anything.
For the folks at home, if they can hear you.
So this kind of just support Alex in some of the research that I've done in my daily career as an archaeologist. A lot of the work, or at least presence of the Chinese in the northern counties up here have been a lot related to the roadworks up here. So a lot of the roads that exist today, from the Gasky Toll Road to some of the main highways, were all constructed with labor by people from China. So just kind of bringing that up. One document that exists is this book from the Office of Historic Preservation from Sacramento. It's called The 5 Views, an Ethnic Historic Site Survey for California. So it has a huge section on Chinese throughout the whole state, and they kind of focus it by county. And they also kind of go by a site location of what was considered historic and significant at the time. From the 1988 is when it's published. One individual that hired a lot of people was Horace Gasky, who was a big player, as Alex mentioned, and there's the picture. So he employed them for the construction of his toll road, which you can still drive along right now. There's also his mining operations that were in around the area. There's his stores that were in Waldo, Oregon, and as well as HAPI Camp, and his farm, a bunch of other locations as well. Places I can't exactly tell you because they're protected by law at the moment because of archaeology, but there is also evidence throughout the areas, from just individual objects to larger landscape features that show products that came from China that are kind of out in the middle of these counties up here and stuff like that. So there are definitely pieces of China that are still, and Chinese people that were here around this area. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more.
This is not a question. This is a comment for Chinese people who are born in America. There are 2 expressions. One is bamboo shoot, and the other one is huji doi, which means take paper son.
Interesting. There you go.
I'm sorry?
What is bamboo shooting? I've never heard of that.
Well, you've heard of yellow on the outside, white on the inside?
I think we have time for 1 more if anyone else has any questions. Anything else that any of our panelists would like to share with the audience before we end this evening? Sure.
So, of course, I talked too long and so was not able to get to everything I wanted to actually talk about. But one thing I really ran into in researching the Del Norte County history is this idea of the connections between all of these different counties and the communities in the different counties. So, too often we think of boundaries between counties as being, completely humongous. You can't get across them. They're different entities, which of course is not true at all. It's much the same way as we often think of different time periods as not being connected, but of course they all are. So I did find 3 specific connections between Del Norte County people and some of the other counties in the area that I thought were pretty striking. Chinese Masons were mentioned both by Dero and by Jessica, and that is a way that I found that Chinese communities in Del Norte were connected to those in Trinity and in Humboldt, in that there were Chinese Masons lodges in Weaverville, which is actually the first place where we know of where the term Chinese Masons was actually used in this country. There was also a Chinese Masons Lodge here in Eureka that's mentioned in an 1881 Humboldt Times newspaper article. And there's also an 1880s Humboldt Times newspaper article reprinting an article from the Del Norte County paper talking about the Chinese Masons having a celebration in 1883 in Crescent City. So we know that there were these lodges in the different communities. Another connection was, of course, Charlie Moon has been mentioned as being supposedly the only Chinese who remained in Humboldt County, but of course there were more. And there was a lady, a Caucasian lady, who worked as a teacher in the very northern area of Humboldt around Orleans from 1904 to 1907. And she wrote a letter which was published in the paper in the 1950s talking about these other elderly at that time Chinese men that she knew who lived in the area, and several of them had Native American wives and had families in the area. And one thing she mentioned in this letter was she said about these people, they never ventured far from the river, and twice when I lived there, Chinese relatives came to visit them from Siskiyou County. So that was a striking connection there. And then again, talking about these Chinese men who managed to stay in northern Humboldt after the time of the expulsion and who had families here as part of the community here. There was a mention in a recollection by a man who was a child in Crescent City at the time of the expulsion in 1886. His father was actually the sheriff of Del Norte County, and so he talked about his memories of Chinese people in Crescent City coming to his father to try and get him to help them when the expulsions were happening. But this man mentioned in his recollections that there was a man who is referred to as Chinese Bao, and said that he had worked as a packer with a mule train of his own in Del Norte County, but that then he retired to live along the Klamath and had a wife there and a family there. And at the time that this man was writing in 1965, he said one of the children of this Chinese Bao, the mule train packer, was still alive, which I'm guessing he's probably the same Wong Bao, or later known as Billy Bao, who is, there's a picture of him in the exhibit here, highlighting him as one of the Chinese people who succeeded in remaining in Humboldt County. So again, it's just really striking to see all these connections and the fact that all these communities were working together and part of each other's lives. So thanks.
Let's give all of our panelists one big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here and being supportive of all the institutions that have made this exhibit and these symposiums possible. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.